Welcome to the Mullin It Over podcast with Reverend Jack Mullins and Austin Covey. How's it going? Welcome to another episode of Mulling It Over with Reverend Jack Mullins and myself, Austin Covey.
We're looking at different questions that we have encountered as clergy and laity in lifetimes within the church. One that came up, and Austin probably is in a better position to at least provide some background information because he is closer to the experience, being what are the 10 most frequently asked questions in youth groups. I spent most of my career working with youth groups, either in the local church or in the church camp setting. And obviously it would depend upon the age of the youth. Middle school, early teens would obviously ask different questions than the high schoolers. Austin, what were some of the questions you remember your peers asking?
So as a young kid, I remember why, because young boys are all fascinated with dinosaurs. There are probably some young girls too, but a lot of young boys are fascinated with dinosaurs. I can only speak from the position of young boys. So why aren't dinosaurs in the Bible was one that came up.
Okay. What was the answer y'all were given?
I couldn't tell you. I don't remember. I have a different understanding of it now, but I have no idea. That was 30 years ago. I don't remember what the answer was then.
That's one reason I declared a long time ago, I don't work with pre-adolescent children.
You got your limits, huh?
I do have my limits. I don't work with anyone below 6th grade. But to answer that question, my response would be there was no paleontological.
Yeah, it sounds good enough.
Paleontological study at the time those earliest books of the Bible were put together. Nobody knew how to read fossils. Nobody understood the existence of fossils. For that population of civilization, the world began, and it began with them. There was no concept of a world previously. So I would say because no one could conceptualize that there were creatures before themselves. Why did we not have dinosaurs on the ark? Is a question that comes up periodically.
That's the joke about they missed the wake-up call, right?
They missed the boat, so to speak. But I think practically, at least for mainstream and progressive Christianity, simply they were already extinct by the time the flood myths came to pass. By the time there were people appropriate to record events or to pass on mythology of the era, they were already dead and gone. So they were not within the framework of recollection.
That makes sense. So I think you touched on there the third one, which is when you mentioned the flood. Did the whole world flood?
Theirs did.
And as a kid, when you read, when you read the story or when the story is read to you, it's like the whole world flooded. It's like, did the whole world really flood? It's like,
and, there's no real way to answer that because we did not have reports or information from the rest of the world. But for those people, that was the world.
Yes.
And from their perspective, the whole world flooded. Their reality went underwater.
Well, it's interesting how that is true, right? There's the world and there's our world, and those are not always the same thing. But as far as, particularly with no communication, as far as we're concerned, that was the world.
Absolutely. I remember both from being a youth and working with youth, about the time they hit 14 to 17, you start getting lots of questions regarding the morality of human reproduction.
Yeah.
am I going to go to hell if? And the answer to that is going to shift depending upon the theological understanding of certain rules and laws in Scripture and the dominance of certain morality tenets. Am I wrong for feeling this way or that way? Those questions would always come up, and I was fortunate that I had youth leaders, and I hope I was a youth leader, who said, you feel what you feel and your feelings are valid. That doesn't mean you have to act upon every feeling you experience. In spite of the single passage where Jesus implied the thought is equal to the deed, I have trouble making sense of that and making that truly applicable, because sometimes one cannot necessarily control the directions their mind may wander, but they can certainly control, in most cases, how they choose to act upon.
Whether they act on that or not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, another question that I would hear from time to time, especially in church camps where you're in a very unique kind of religious experience.
Very safe space for asking.
Very safe space. It's generally a very relaxed space, a very non-traditional space. And the question would be, why do we need the church? Why do we have to have sanctuaries? Why do we have to have organized religion?
I still ask that sometimes.
I understand. And, I think an answer to that, and again, it's going to depend upon one's background and the background and doctrinal philosophy and theology of the particular denomination or church. You don't necessarily have to have a sanctuary, a order of worship. I'd have people point to progressive worship service, contemporary Christian worship services, and say, they don't have an order of worship. And I'd say, yeah, they do. It's just not the same. You sit down with them and you realize they are very strictly formulated. You've got three songs. You've got a prayer. You've got a scripture. You've got 2 songs. You've got a message. You've got 3 songs at the end. That's liturgy. That's order of worship. It may feel more relaxed because of the way it's presented.
When they may not be printing out when they say order of worship, they may be thinking of the physical paper. It's like, well, they may not be printing a piece of paper and handing it to you, but...
Yeah. When they're putting something upon a screen, they most definitely have sat down and spent a lot of time working out the order of that service so they can get it on the screen.
Right. They're not typing that in real time.
No. You and I both know that isn't happening.
It's not going to work.
You do that far more than you should. But
we've tried it. It doesn't work well.
No. What are some other questions you can recall?
I'm trying to think.
A question that came up in our youth group as we were dealing with younger and middle teens, grades probably grades 9 and 10. Is it acceptable to like a boy, like a girl from a different church, from a different denomination? When I was a kid, and this would have been back in the late 60s, early 70s, back before probably some of the parents of today's youth were born, a question was, as a Protestant kid, is it okay for me to like a Catholic? Because there was a great deal of distance between Protestants and Catholics.
And I think maybe there's still maybe a distance between them, but I would think maybe the newer generation question of that, is it okay to like somebody from a different religion entirely, you know?
Well, and a question regarding interracial dating and marriage. That was less of a question when I was a kid because it was really just kind of inconceivable. It never was elevated to the level of giving conscious thought. When I was working with youth groups, it was more of a reality, and it was a concern of the kids in how do we deal with our parents who are still carrying the baggage from when they grew up in the 50s or 60s or even 70s. And now I think we look around and, again, depending upon one's theology, depending upon the social arena, the culture of where you live is going to dictate the acceptability. But my observation and my personal family experience is it's becoming less and less a cultural issue. And from the perspective of the church, particularly any moderate to progressive Christian tradition, there's a recognition that we are all children of God irrespective of the pigmentation of our skin.
When the Bible says we're all made in the image.
Yeah. Most asked questions, I think it's really an open-ended, and to say what are 10, that'd be hard to narrow down to what the top 10 would actually be. I think we've hit on 5 or 6 that I recall coming up most frequently. I suspect that, because I've been out of that arena for probably 15 years.
Yeah.
And so I know that the cultural and religious needs and concerns of kids has shifted. I would suspect that there may be more questions regarding, for some of our youth, I think I am gay, am I going to hell? Again, that's a doctrinal perspective. And that's going to depend upon the stance of your particular denomination.
I guess I would say my initial response to that would be none of us can determine that.
That's up to God.
Yeah, whether you believe it or not is like you said, is a doctrinal perspective. But whether there's any legitimacy to that belief is, that's between you and God.
And when I hear about or observe children who are essentially banished from their churches or thrown out of their homes, my initial reaction is, in no way is that Christian. You know, that's your own bias, that's your own personal human reaction, even if you are acting in the name of the church. Whatever church it might be.
Well, like you said, I would, even if it's the bias of the church, I would say, not like personal bias, but sort of a theological bias, I would say that's a departation from Scripture.
I would agree.
In that Jesus very much, in my interpretation anyway, seems to be about loving one another and caring for one another. And it, he loved and cared for a lot of people whose life choices he might have had a different opinion of. The tax collectors, and none of us like tax collectors, right? No offense if you work for the IRS, do not audit me. But, I do think it's funny that ironic, whatever, that the ones they sort of call out in the Bible are the tax collectors. I think somehow they had a deep understanding that position was probably going to be disliked for forever. It's like, this one's going to be transcendent. We're not going to,
right.
But Jesus ate lunch with those people. He wasn't hateful to them, or he did kind of give the boot to the money changers, but he wasn't maybe hateful. He just told them to kick rocks.
Well, and part of that issue, and I don't want to go too far afield from the initial question, was not that they were engaging in actions of monetary exchange, but where they had chosen to do it, which was in the courtyard of the temple. Consider that as the foyer or the narthex to your church. If there were people engaging in transactions, we will sell you offering tokens, but we're going to mark the price up 25% over what you are credited with when you give your offering.
Well, and that's what I was going to say too. Is my understanding it was also fairly exploitive.
Yeah.
So
it was taking place within the confines of holy ground, and not only for a legitimate and fair profit, but for an exploitative amount. So, moving beyond youth group kinds of questions, what are some questions that you have encountered, because you've worked within the adult leadership of the church off and on for years, and probably working for the church had to address or pass on certain questions. What were some of the, or what are some of the more frequently asked questions in the church about the church?
When I was thinking about that as you said it, and I think you and I are going to have different perspectives on this question, because you get the pastoral questions, whereas I tend to get more of the operational questions.
Okay.
Things like, where does the money go? That's a question on the operational side that you do get asked.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of other questions I've been asked that would be noteworthy to speak about, not, why wasn't such and such in the newsletter this week, or, something. I feel like the operational side questions tend to be a little bit more trivial.
And yet, because I will get those same kinds of questions, and I look at those, when someone comes to me with a concern, why did the church do A, B, or C? If that person has the drive or the sense of need to ask that question, that person is probably reflecting a question that is more commonly held than that one person. I've always worked on the perception. If one person comes forward, there's probably 10 others who have had that same question.
They're just a representative.
Essentially. And what you're doing is providing a response not just to that individual, but to the 10 people with whom they have spoken.
Right.
Well,
I think there was a lot of questions that came up during COVID, just from an operational side of, when are we coming back? Why aren't we coming back? What are we going to do when we come back? Is streaming going to hang around after we come back? There was a lot of those questions being asked.
And those are not merely operational. Those are also a reflection of the congregation's need for interaction, their need for human contact, for that opportunity to gather together in the name of God in worship. It's phrased in a very concrete kind of way, when and where and how.
Right.
But the motivation behind it is, I'm lonely, I'm feeling isolated. When can I come back into community with my friends and fellow church members? And unfortunately, sometimes there are no really good answers.
Right.
As soon as possible doesn't
meet that need.
Does not meet the need, absolutely.
When, there were times when we tried to give more concrete answers. There was the website that tracked the COVID infection,
Right.
whatever, and you'd say, well, when it gets below number such and such or above number such and such or what have you. But one of the things that we kind of talked about it that I kind of mentioned at the time is we don't know what normal is going. There's a normal infection rate for the flu, right?
Yeah.
There's a normal infection rate for a lot of stuff. I did never imagine it was going to be totally gone, and
Right.
it's not. But we weren't, that peak hadn't leveled off enough to be able to identify what the normal rate was. So far, if our expectation was to return to a zero number, well, that probably isn't going
Right.
to happen. So it's like, okay, what is normal going to, you know what I mean? What is
Yeah.
normal
or
going to
what
look
is
like?
acceptable.
Right.
And I think we've seen that we managed to survive it to the point where it mutated beyond being as virulent and as deadly as it started out, because when immunity increased, people, the majority did take vaccines and the follow-ups, and the virulence of the virus itself diminished. But it was a long and painful process to get to the point of addressing the need to come together with being responsible to the health and well-being of the physicality of the congregation. And, if it didn't happen quickly enough for some, they got mad and left. If it happened too quickly for others, they just stayed home and essentially left.
Well, I know some who are still, have never been back, like you said, never been back to their church since it happened. They're still watching online, which I guess is, I do think the strides we made in streaming and things like that during that time, I think were, it's not, the situation was not good, but I think those advancements were good.
Yeah, and I would say I agree that is a distinct positive that came out of darkness of a situation. Would I want to see the church have to go through it again? Of course not.
Yeah.
Will it at some point in some way? Of course.
Probably,
I mean,
yeah.
that's the natural progression of humanity.
I was, as we were talking and looking at this and the most asked questions, I think probably the one that you see the most, not maybe from church members, but from people outside the church asking about the church, is the hypocrite question, right? Why are Christians hypocrites? I don't go to church because it's all a bunch of hypocrites.
Okay.
I think because when we were talking about the youth group question, obviously it's from people within the church asking questions. And when we started this one, we were talking about people within the church asking questions. But I think some of the questions I hear the most about the church are actually from external coming in.
And that's one, I think it's been around forever. Why would I want to go to the church? The church is just full of hypocrites and sinners. And the best response I've seen or come up with in response to that was, the church is not a country club for saints, but a hospital for sinners. You come to the church for redemption and for improvement, not because you're perfect, but because you simply want to get better.
Well, theoretically, if you were perfect, you wouldn't need to come to the church, right? So,
Well, and that gets to another question, which was, if there was no sin in the world, there would be no wrath of God. Or would there be the need for the wrath of God? If there was no sin in the world, what would God have to get mad about? So, if there were no sin in the world, would there have been a need for Jesus to come to the world and be crucified for the sins of humanity if there were no sins of humanity for which him to be crucified?
are you asking me?
Yeah,
Did he come to be crucified for our sins?
that is traditional doctrine, that Jesus was sent to be offered as redemption for the sins of humanity.
Can we be slightly heretical?
Absolutely, man. We're DOC.
That's a good answer. Personally, I guess I would posit that maybe the sins aren't what keep us out of heaven. And, well, you have to sort of start that from the basis of I don't ascribe to original sin. So for those of you who don't know what that is, original sin is and correct me if I'm wrong, the understanding that we are all sinful by the nature of decisions made by Adam and Eve, and therefore we just inherit the sin. Is that a very basic way to...
Good answer.
So, as we said on a previous podcast, Jack talked about we ascribe more to the age of accountability. So instead of inherently having sin, we view sin as a choice or a disobedience from God, and you have to have a certain level of accountability to understand that what you're doing is disobedience, right? And so there's either an age or a mental capacity or however you want to, or a level of education or whatever in that, certain, I would posit like certain tribes out in the middle of nowhere may have a just different moral understanding of things. Typically morals carry over across
certain basic principles.
But, obviously there were, different cultures throughout history that practice human sacrifice and things like that. We would consider that to be immoral. But to them at that time, with their understanding, that's what they did. Sorry, I digressed a little bit there. So I don't think we are born inherently with sin, right? That's why we do a believer's baptism, et cetera, et cetera. So if you view sin as being an act of disobedience unto God, and you say sin is what separates us from God, I would say not practically, but theoretically, you could earn your way to heaven because you could have not sinned. If it's a choice, you could have just always made the right choice. Now, the mathematical probability of that's obviously very low. You're not going to do it, but theoretically you could. And since I think we believe, I sort of speak for you, I guess, because this is church doctrine, that we believe by grace through faith, not through works. I don't necessarily know that sin of itself is what separates us from God. I might posit that there's a difference between being holy or being able to enter the presence of God versus being sinful. And so I think, yes, sin is a separating factor, but I think ultimately even without sin we're not holy because we ascribe to grace through faith in Jesus, not through making the right decision all the time. Does that have I lost?
No,
okay.
No, that makes sense. I think the basic question was, if no one sins, is there a need for a redemptive act of God? And if there is nothing for which to be forgiven, then...
So I didn't quite get around to it yet. I would say yes, there's still a need for Jesus because Jesus makes us holy. Jesus provides us the path to being holy and being able to exist in God's presence.
Okay.
So I don't know, personally, I am not speaking for the church. I am not speaking for the church, just a disclaimer. Personally, I don't know that sin is exclusively what separates us from God. However, I do believe that Jesus was necessary because, like we talked about Adam and Eve. I mean, Adam and Eve were still mortal humans. They may not have understood or had the capacity to understand sin before they ate of the tree.
But what if they had never done that? What if there was never even original sin? What if that tree was either never withheld from them, or they had never engaged in that initial act?
I would say, personally, I believe there still needed to be that bridge that gets them to a place of being holy.
But they were already there.
No.
They were walking side by side with God.
Right, but they weren't in heaven. God came to visit them. We still
Was
posit...
that not their heaven?
But they still had to die, though. They were mortal.
Did they?
Yeah.
At that point?
Mm-hmm. It says
No,
it.
at that point they had not been, to my understanding. We may want to cut this out.
They were still mortal. They were just without sin.
Okay.
And God
Let's edit this section.
Well, I don't know. They say God came to visit them, but we have also posited that the Holy Spirit still comes to visit us now.
Okay, but it's a totally different context. Would God, through the Holy Spirit, feel the need to visit us now in the presence that we conceive of now? Because our whole conception of religious reality would be radically different if our relationship with God were radically different.
Yes.
So, anyway, that's a interesting question there, and it's purely speculative because not only do we not know, we have no way to.
We'll find out eventually.
Well,
when we die.
Well, will we?
I don't know.
Because if that is, and it obviously is not a part of human reality or human experience, will we even get a glimpse of what reality might have been like?
Well, and that's, I guess we could put that under the frequently asked questions is what is it, when we die, you'll hear people posit that, like, I'll get to see so-and-so. It's like, was that how it works? You hear that a lot around funerals or whatever. When somebody passes, they say, well, I'll get to see him again. Like, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know what happens when we get there.
That's right.
People will say, well, I'm going to ask God a lot of questions. If I have the opportunity, I'm certainly going to too. But
yeah. But, we take so much of our understanding of afterlife from non-scriptural sources. A lot of it came out of Dante's Inferno in terms of the images of heaven and hell. But they were powerful images, and culture latched on to them.
They stuck around.
They stuck around. Absolutely.
I don't remember who it was, but I heard somebody one time say, well, it may just be one of those sort of collective consciousness things where you die and you just know. There is no asking. You just become part of this greater collective consciousness, and you now know whatever whatever it was you had questions to. I think it's an interesting thing to think about,
Yeah. That's one of those things that I chalk up to God has that in hand. That's a God thing. I'm not going to worry about it. No. Doesn't matter what I think. It's God's decision in the final analysis. And it kind of goes back to, is a gay or lesbian child going to go to hell? I don't think so, personally. Ultimately, that's a God call. And even though I am in a role that puts me in a position to be almost required to speak prophetically, there are certain words I try not to put into the mouth of God, because I have a real strong suspicion those are going to come back and bite me one day.
I always feel like if you default to love, it's going to be okay.
Exactly.
It does say, for God so loved the world, and
love
the Lord,
and grace will win out always.
Love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. It doesn't, I don't remember Jesus ever being quoted as saying to hate anything.
No.
As long as you stick with love, you're probably good.
Exactly. A question that I've often had working within the Christian Church Disciples of Christ are questions regarding, one, where do you come from as a church, as a denomination?
Or just, who are you? Yeah.
Who are you?
Because we don't have the same level of name recognition as a lot of
not within the general public. Now, your mainstream progressive denominations know who we are because we have worked collaboratively for 150 or so years. So they know who the disciples of Christ, they know who the DOC are.
Right.
The Presbyterians, see us as kind of renegade cousins because we jumped ship on the Presbyterians in the 1830s. And as far as the Methodists and the others, I'm not sure any of them quite know what to do with this. But I'll hear questions regarding the logo, and the logo is right here, if you can see it. It's a red chalice with a St. Andrew's cross, or a leaning cross, which is considered to be the St. Andrew's cross, who was the patron saint to Scotland and identified as the patron saint of what became the Scottish Presbyterian Church, from whom the forebearers of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ movement came. They got crossways with the presbyteries over issues of baptism and communion, and it really was a situation in which the presbyteries said, "You're fired," and they said, "No, we quit."
Right.
And so the two groups came together and formed Christian Church Disciples. So the red chalice symbolizes the centrality of the Lord's Supper in all of our worships as a common act of communion and coming together as Christians, not just congregationally or denominationally, but all Christians. And the St. Andrew's Cross reminds us of from whence we came, our roots in Scottish Presbyterian Church.
When, I guess for a point of clarification, we came from the Scottish Presbyterian Church, but we were founded in the United States, right? The Scottish Presbyterians came from Scotland and were here.
Right, right.
And then we were founded here, so we didn't.
We are the first indigenous denomination in the U.S. We're the first denomination to have its origins on U.S. soil, North American soil.
So I was trolling social media, as I do,
Okay.
where a lot of these questions come from. And I saw a quote, and I've seen it 2 or 3 times since then, and it says, leadership, this is obviously not church specific, but I still thought it was interesting. Leadership is a commitment to being misunderstood.
Okay.
What is your initial reaction to that?
Commitment, I might question the use of that term, but the acceptance of the risk of being regularly misunderstood, I would agree.
When I said, I think, or just like when I was thinking about it, I would say that it's true if you are a visionary leader. That's why I think in business, a lot of times there's a difference between a business founder and a CEO type. You know, the business founders tend to be much more visionary, whereas the CEO types don't. From a practical perspective, like you said, the commitment part would concern me, because you can write off a lot of things just saying, well, I'm committed to being, it's like, hey, nobody got that memo. Well, I'm committed to being misunderstood. It's like, well, I guess I would say maybe leadership is a commitment to effectively communicating, or attempting to effectively communicate, because if nobody understands you, they're not going to follow you, and if nobody follows you, you're not a leader. You might be in your own mind, but definitionally, you have to have followers, and if nobody understands you, it's hard for them to follow you.
Well, and I think I would say to this is the commitment aspect is not to necessarily being misunderstood, but you're committed to seeking to gain a level of understanding when you are misunderstood. Obviously, for those of us who work with groups, attempt to provide leadership for groups, we may make a statement that's going to be misunderstood by someone. I mean, you can't get a group of 50 people and guarantee that all 50 are going to understand the meaning behind your words every time you speak them. But I can be committed to being willing to sit down, let you quiz me, and come to a common understanding as to what I meant. Right.
So you are operating, we all know it's a reality we're going to be misunderstood.
Yeah.
But I don't think I'm committed to, to me, I guess the term commitment implies that we are accepting or okay, or maybe even driving towards that,
It sounds to me like I am going to intentionally work at being misunderstood.
That's how I interpret it.
And to me, that's stupid.
Yeah, exactly.
It's going to happen enough without being intentional about it.
And I really think it's being misunderstood is really in a lot of ways counterproductive to, it's hard to, it's the kind of the Tower of Babel thing, right? Like if being misunderstood worked, the tower would have got built. So, misunderstanding by definition derailed the process of the project. And I think that's true for any project, is if you don't have good understanding or you're not on the same page, it's very hard to get anything done.
Right. I recall sometime in the past, someone said, if you have a point to make, try to make it 3 times in 3 different ways. And that's hopefully somebody will pick up on it in one of your explanations. Make it simple enough to be understood and concise enough to be remembered.
When, in a lot of ways, I think leadership is actually the opposite of, we've kind of been saying that, it's almost the opposite of the commitment to being misunderstood. It's really the commitment to helping everybody achieve a level of understanding.
Right. And being able to then help them focus their energies toward a common goal or set of goals.
Right. Because, like you said, those 50 people, yes, they might interpret what you say, but also if you give them a goal, there's going to be a lot of miscommunication happening between them. And in a lot of ways, in a leadership position, your job is to kind of be the conduit that makes all that work. I guess I'm thinking from more like a project management or more of a practical, like a goal-oriented leadership. Getting people to communicate, getting them to understand each other's jobs or roles in the project, understanding why we do certain things or when we do certain things. In a lot of ways, I think that's kind of key to leadership. And to me, that's the antithesis of being misunderstood. You're the one trying to get everybody on the same page and reach a level of understanding.
And within the life of the church, the larger your church gets, the more difficult it is for the minister, say, to have enough comprehensive understanding of each of the various programs in order to answer those questions. What are we trying to accomplish by doing this? Single pastor congregations can function effectively, in my opinion, and based on studies I've seen, up to about 150 members. Beyond that point, the ability to oversee and work with all of the various committees and groups begins to diminish. And that's when you see churches begin to hire additional pastoral staff.
It just becomes too much to...
Yeah, it becomes too much to manage. The more healthy congregations I see start by bringing in someone to work with programs of Christian education and youth and or worship. And when I say worship, I mean generally if they are serious about moving progressively into a future, they're looking at someone who can come in and develop worship other than the traditional. Now, they've got that in hand. They know how to do that.
If they've grown to that size, that they're good at doing that part of it.
They don't think about it, which is sometimes part of the problem because the process becomes rote. And
I guess my question that came to my mind when you were talking about that is the flip side of that. You say up to 150, it's a good time to hire. Just pick up Amazon and order you a minister to hire additional ministerial staff. At what point if a church is a certain size, or maybe they were big and they dropped to a certain size, does it become counterproductive to have too many ministers?
Oh, well, when you can't afford them.
Well, I was going to say, obviously there's the budget side of it when you just get really top heavy on your salaries, but sometimes I wonder when they're smaller if you have too many competing.
It's going to depend on the job descriptions, and this is the administrative end of church stuff, is to evaluate program and to evaluate the needs, and then you have to decide, do the staff members you have, do their skills match up with the needs?
'Cause I could also see if you just didn't have as much going on, people without a job to do sometimes is not a good thing.
Right.
People without something to do can be not good. So
Yeah, I've been in churches, and fairly recently, and you have too. They have a historical imperative to have someone in a certain staff position, and many times that will be a children or youth position, even when they have no children or youth or families of that age in the church.
yes,
But they have a need to have someone on the staff with that job description.
a youth minister for
No youth.
a 2-person youth group. Yeah, or no youth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I know the argument, well, we want to be prepared. Oh, okay, I understand that, but is it really a reasonable and cost-effective expenditure of funds to do that at this point?
When I just thinking on that, and because I've made this argument, those funds might be better invested in doing the programs to attract the youth. If they're tied up in a salary, you can't use them for other things. And if you don't have any money to do anything to attract youth, maybe, maybe you need that money to do some programming that might bring somebody in. And
Yeah. And the other side of that argument, and I've been on both sides, is if you don't have anyone to implement the programs,
chicken or the
because
egg.
the investment in the individual is an investment in the programs.
As long as you have the resources to actually do whatever they want to do.
and that's the challenge.
It's the chicken or the egg kind of conversation.
Rarely do churches willingly hire a minister of older adults and have no minister of education or youth. Although a few will, because they are accepting of the reality, we are aging, we are not attracting youth, let's put our resources where our primary need is. In a way it's a give up, and yet it's also a matter of accepting a reality of undesirable consequences, but that's where you are. The trick is to then be able to see how can we do both.
Right. It is certainly hard to grow or maintain a church if if the base of people that you are trying to attract are all in the latter stages of life.
And many churches say, we are a church of empty nesters and older. Why don't we just grow this church? And all of the research, all of the real experience says that population tends not to move around much in terms of churches. You'll see someone occasionally who will leave one church and go to another because they got mad at the first church.
I was going to say, it's always if they got mad about something.
And but that's not really how you grow a church, and you're not going to grow it for a multi-generational experience because they're at the end of their generation.
When I was a kid, was people would leave because they got mad, and then give it about a year or so, they got mad at the other place, and now they're so you're just trading this person who's just getting mad about something all the time, and it's not really a growth measurement.
No, it's not, and it's more than a myth you grow through your ministry to children, youth, and families, and that's for sure.
That's everything that I've read says that's. I was reading an article. It was in one of those magazines that we get from some guy who used to be an associate at apparently a very large church over in the Plano area. I don't remember the name of the church. And he said every time they did something specifically geared towards youth, they grew.
Sure.
And they grew across all generational brackets. He said would do a youth thing and would grow with people in their 80s.
Sure.
People just like to be around kids.
Well, and my experience was we would have, my wife would periodically host a children's musical. Her background is in education and speech and drama. And so around Christmas time, she would direct a musical, would begin, working on it in the fall for younger children. And when you got the children involved, well, you were almost automatically going to get the parents involved. And then you'd draw in the grandparents. Yeah. And many, many times those people, after a couple of months of coming and watching their kids work and the interest and time spent with their children, they would become comfortable. They would become assimilated, if you will, into the life of the congregation and realize this is a good place for me too. And unintended consequences, but I guess in a lot of ways that's how the church has always grown.
Yes.
I had a senior minister one time who, and I will say we never got along theologically, we never got along professionally, and he got in my face about spending too much time working with youth, and that was my primary job responsibility.
I'm just doing my job.
And he said,
you're
not addressing the needs of the adult congregation. And I came back at him and said, when I am ministering to so-and-so and her mother, am I not also ministering to their grandmother and grandfather who are also members of this congregation? I'm ministering to the entire family. And it doesn't stop with that one individual. It's a systemic amount of attention, because the grandparents are going to say, thank you, church, for caring for the needs of my grandchild and my adult child.
That's a much more professional response, because I would have been inclined to tell him, no, that's your job. You're the senior minister. Your job is the adults.
But, it's all a matter of recognizing that in my opinion, the church is intergenerational and interrelated whole. It's a single organism.
Well, and like you said, if you were taking care of the adults but not taking care of the children, the grandparents and the parents would be like, hey, why isn't my kid? I know of churches, I know of people who move churches because of children's programming.
Absolutely.
I don't know of anybody who's left a church that had good children's programming because they wanted better parental programming. I think that parental instinct kicks in, and we tend to default to whatever's best for our kids. We'll work it out, but what's best for the kids is usually what we go for.
I remember one of my best church members was an active lifetime member of the Roman Catholic Church. And he came from a dual background. His mother was Presbyterian, his father was Roman Catholic. He would go to early Mass with Dad. They would come home, pick up Mom, and go to worship at the Presbyterian Church. He married a single mother of 2 kids. The kids got involved in our church. And so the parents started attending. And they became 2 of the stronger members of the congregation. In fact, he became an elder of the congregation while he was still actively participating at the Catholic Church up the street. When they joined, he asked me, would you please not notify the Catholic Church, because I'd like to continue. I said, sure, that's up to you. And then 6 months later or thereabouts, he came back and said, yeah, don't worry about St. Joe's. we've had a falling out. I'm all yours now. I said, cool.
You're pretty effectively churched if you're going to. If
Yeah.
you're actively participating in 2 churches at once, you're checking your boxes.
Absolutely. And they came because where their kids were was where their heart was.
When I knew a guy at the church I grew up in they had a daughter, and she started coming. I think she had met some friends in school or whatever that went to our church, and she started coming for Sunday school, and he would just drop her off.
Yeah.
And then one day in the parking lot, he ran into somebody he knew, and they said, well, why don't you come in and grab a cup of coffee? So he started every Sunday coming in, and they would sit. They didn't actually go to church. They went into the building and sat and had coffee and talked. And he said, eventually my wife said, well, I probably should go in the sanctuary sometime. And that was 40 years ago. He's passed away now, but that was 40 or 50 years ago, and he never left. So.
Yeah. But, it's funny that you mentioned that, because my dad was one of those who had his spot in the basement of the church, old Christian church. And everybody knew where to find him. And he would be sitting on a couch down there with a cup of coffee. And it was almost as though he was holding court, because people would come by and sit down and visit with him a little bit, and then they'd rotate. He'd just stay there. And I asked him about it one time. He said, I could get up and walk around. I wouldn't see half as many people. If I stay in one spot, if they want to talk to me, they know where to find me.
Yeah, they can all come find you.
But that was an important ministry.
Mm-hmm.
For a lot of those folks, that was church, because they came into the presence and encountered one whom they respected and trusted, and who they knew had the love and interest of the church foremost in his mind.
When sometimes I think we get I don't know that greater feeling is the right word, but we get maybe a higher level of church feeling. I don't know that that's the word I'm looking for. Because they could come and speak to him, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Sometimes you need more than just sometimes you need an interactive worship experience, I guess is what I'm trying to, as opposed to just an observational worship experience.
Right.
And sometimes regular church can turn into an observational worship experience.
And I think, we mentioned earlier the need for more progressive contemporary style worship, and there's a perception that kind of worship has to be theologically conservative or evangelical. And I have always argued that point. You determine the theology of it, and whether it's liberal or conservative, by what is said within the structure. But you can build upon the structure.
The structure is not inherently one or the other.
The structure is not inherently one or the other. But you can use it to provide an alternative experience. Because, sure, lots of people enjoy traditional worship. I've said for years, look at the numbers and where is the greatest growth in numbers taking place. And it's taking place in quote-unquote Bible churches, in your more progressive contemporary style services. I've attended a few. I've listened to some of the messages. I just can't believe that it's all because everyone agrees with what's being said.
Well, and the ones that I have, I hate to use the term mega church, but some of the larger churches that I've attended that follow that style, not to be overly critical, but the message might have been pretty thin. You know what I mean? There maybe wasn't a lot of theological substance, I guess I would say. And that may not be universally true for those places. I may just have happened to hit them on those Sundays, Everybody has down days or whatever, or maybe there was some reason they felt the specific need to talk about what they did at the time, but it was very surface level from a
And some of that
standpoint.
is intentional, because they operate from a position that many of the people whom they attract may be first-time church people, may not be people who grow up with a deeper understanding. And we have to present the gospel message in a simple, I'm not going to say simplistic because to me that term is insulting.
Right.
But we present it in a simple, readily understandable form. And it may not have a lot of complex theological meaning, but then again, it was said one time, someone said to a noted theologian, "Why are you engaging with the laity? They can't understand deep theology." And so attended worship, and the opening hymn was, "Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so." And the theologian went back and said, "That is some of the deepest Christology and theology you will ever encounter." Think about what that one simple song says. They can understand, but you have to get your conversation out of the textbooks and out of academia and back into the language of real life people. And that requires some work on the part of the quote-unquote theologian.
Right. When we kind of talked about that previously in a previous episode about how sometimes our denomination can be a little bit too, what's the word?
Rationalistic.
Yeah, or that's not the word I was looking for, but that works. We study it a little too hard, and we get out of the experiential and into the almost scientific of it.
Yeah.
But back to those churches like you were talking about, almost necessitate, maybe not necessitate, but they do tend to angle themselves towards first-time or newer people into that experience. A term that I've heard used for them, and I think it was used in a negative sense at the time it was used, which I don't really understand because I don't see why this is negative, but they referred to them as launchpad churches. They're an entry point to.
Okay.
And the context in which I heard it, I think it was being used as a negative, and I don't understand why that's a negative because we need that's a necessary part of the. No, I think whether they do it through small groups or whether they point you in other directions or whatever, I do think it's important to go beyond that.
It's an entry point.
Right. But I think the entry point is necessary to send you off to someplace else, but I don't think you just sit at, I don't think it's good if you're just going to stay at the entry point. You know what I mean? If you sit on the launch pad, that's not really beneficial, but you need one.
And I've heard it stated about churches that may identify themselves by the name Gateway Church. And somebody said, gateway is a term you use referring to a drug that directs you to a further drug. And I said, yeah, but if a gateway is the pathway to something beyond, then it doesn't have to be negative. It can be a very, very positive.
You just want to make sure the gateway doesn't have too many gatekeepers, too.
There is that. And to what is the gateway leading you? Yeah, absolutely.
That is true because the imagery is like back to your Dante's Inferno reference or other things. There's both the imagery of the gateway to heaven and the gateway to hell, right?
Yeah.
So both of them have a gateway in that ideology. Just go in very different directions.
Yeah. Well, I think it's safe to say that there are always more questions about the church and faith than can ever be answered in a single setting. I hope that anyone who hears this may respond with some of your unique personal questions regarding how you feel the church has either been a benefit to you or how perhaps the church let you down or perhaps even in your mind damaged you because that happens as well.
Unfortunately, I think it happens a lot more than Well, any is more than it should, but it seems to happen, or maybe I just hear from those people, but it seems to happen a lot.
It does, and I hear folks in podcasts who refer in generalities to the way the church treated them or a segment of the population, and I want to reach out and say, because that was your unique experience within a certain branch of the church, be very careful not to paint the whole church with that brush.
That is an irony I think you see sometimes when people say, when they are criticizing maybe the church for painting them within a certain light, but then they are...
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Well, y'all hate all blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, all blah, blah, blah is that's a big net to cast. And y'all, if you're referring to the entire body of Christendom, is a pretty big net to cast too.
And
so,
some I listen to do not narrow it down to one branch of the church, but will sometimes just refer to Christianity.
Yeah.
And that's
pretty big.
That's unfair.
Yeah, pretty big net to cast.
Because not all denominations or all congregations are going to act in those ways.
Well, that's what I was going to say. It could have been a branch, it could have been a congregation, or it could have just been a jerk, you know? I don't purport to speak for all Christians. I don't think you do either.
No.
And you shouldn't assume that any one person speaks for the entirety of the body.
Yeah. That being said, there are certain denominations who have come out with very strong and specific doctrinal standards about, for example, I was listening to a podcast regarding the reaction of the Church of Latter-day Saints and some of their statements regarding gays and lesbians. And one of the more recent said something to the effect of, if you are gay or lesbian, there's still a place for you in the church as long as you do not act upon it. Okay, that's one thing. Then it went on to say, for those who are actively engaging, you are considered the same as child molesters, murderer, and just went down this list of horrific behaviors. And they said that what they have said is the church in which I grew up has no place for me. And not only that, what does it say about a church that is going to be that judgmental and exclusionary of people who are living out the life God created for them?
Yeah, I'm not even sure if judgmental is the right word for that. That's, you know.
Yeah. But, you know, and many people who enter into biracial relationships have confronted that same kind of thing. You know, you can come, but your spouse can't, and by golly, don't bring those mixed breed children. And that's horrific. To me, that's blasphemy.
Well, I certainly think it is to say don't bring the children.
Yeah.
Jesus specifically said, let the little children come to me.
Yeah, isn't it funny how so many times our ecclesiastical doctrines and positions kind of fly in the face of the words of Christ?
Well, that's, I was just talking to somebody about that the other day about, you know, I think a lot of the Bible, in my opinion, well, any of it should be read in context, but a lot of it, I think, can be interpreted a lot of different ways. A lot of times I say that, you know, it's like read the red letters, you know, in the old King James Version.
Yeah.
When Jesus spoke, it was written in the red letters. It's like, yeah, the red letters are important.
Yeah, and maybe it's time to go back to the red letter versions.
The red letters, you know, the rest of it, you can, I wouldn't say, you know, I don't mean to take it lightly, but there's a lot of it's written by a person in a context to another group of people, kind of like when you talk about Paul's letters or different things like that, but when it's in red,
Yeah.
maybe I take that one, I don't want to say more seriously, but you know what I mean? It's like,
Sure.
It's one thing when one person is writing to other people. It's another thing when Jesus is talking.
I read an article or editorial actually by the editor of Christianity Today.
Mm-hmm.
Christianity Today is a well-known and fairly well-respected journal from the ultra-conservative perspective evangelical side.
Mm.
And the editor was responding to a question that was raised regarding the rumor, quote unquote, that certain evangelical pastors had said to their congregations, don't pay that close of attention to the Sermon on the Mount because some of those lessons are too woke. It's too liberal, too socially aware, and not harsh enough. And he was reacting to that because he knew that to be true.
That kind of boggles my mind a little bit, but
it does mine, and it did his, and yet he fact checked it, and he was in a position to go back and verify. And it's just incomprehensible to me that there are pastors out there, few in number, I hope,
I would certainly hope so, yeah.
that would make those kinds of irresponsible statements.
Don't listen to what Jesus said. That's
basically.
That being the dumbed down version of it, that's a pretty,
yeah,
I would say. At what point do you actually depart Christianity? If
that's a pretty good departure point for me.
Like,
when you, in my opinion, when you reject the gospel for your own social or political agenda.
When we talked about that some, when I made that Star Wars reference a couple episodes ago about when you start to bend things to your will versus, it's not good.
No.
It's not good.
You know, the question regarding clergy who preach prophetically versus politically. And my spin or my perception of that is if you are speaking truth to the gospel, you don't have to speak in terms of politics. If it's in contradiction to the politics of the day, that will be self-evident. You don't need to point it out. And it's always amazed me when someone will come up to me and say, you were preaching politics. I said, never did I mention any political movement, agenda, or politician. Well, but what I said was gospel.
What I said is what it says in the book.
That's right. And
You
if you stick with that, you don't need to worry about the politics of it.
Well, that's like the story you tell about your toes don't get stepped on if they aren't out in the aisle. If you're feeling particularly rubbed the wrong way or put upon, then maybe there's a need for some self-reflection there, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Austin, I've had a good time this morning. We have ranged very far afield, as we tend to do, but it's always a good exercise in mental and theological and ecclesiastical gymnastics. So thank you for the morning. Yeah,
and if y'all have any topics that you would care to hear us talk about, I mean, we can obviously find ways to talk about just about anything. Put those down in the comments or email them to us. I'll put our email in the description for the video. We really appreciate y'all joining us today.
Y'all have a good day. God bless you.